Hey everybody, your friendly death investigator here again. Welcome to our second discussion episode. Before we get into it though, just a brief update. Hopefully you enjoyed the Kathleen Peterson episode. If you haven't already, please go listen and share, and please leave a review on iTunes if you get a chance, or just a rating. It helps us spread to more people. You can follow us on social media at facebook.com/autopsypodcast, twitter.com/autopsy_podcast. And just in the last week or so, we've officially created an Instagram. So instagram.com/autopsypodcast as well. We've also started uploading our shows to YouTube, just trying to reach as many people as we can. So if you like what we're doing, please find us on any of these places and spread us around. It does mean a lot, so thank you. Also, stop by our website, autopsypod.com. We're proud of that as well. Now, we're finishing up wrapping January's episode, so be ready for that. That'll go live in the first week of the month. I'm actually interested in a little feedback for this episode. So in the Kathleen Peterson episode, which is by far our longest episode to date, I spent a lot of time going over every little measurement noted in the autopsy report. So 3/4 inch this, 1/2 inch that kind of stuff. And honestly, I'm curious how you feel about that. I bring this up because you may notice in next month's episode, we've omitted a lot of that. All the descriptions remain, and a few measurements do still remain as well, but there's a school of thought, so to speak, that all of those measurements kind of slow the pace down, and Autopsy is already a show about taking the time to understand what is being said, so I'm curious if some of you found some of that stuff to be a little needless. Personally, I kind of prefer all episodes to be under half an hour, but sometimes some reports can just be really meticulous and may likely call for an expanded length. But I don't know, you tell me. Do you like hearing all of the measurements? You can let us know at autopsypodcast@gmail.com. And of course, if there's something you're curious about with that case as far as the autopsy is concerned that I may have glossed over or didn't explicitly clarify, let me know, and I promise I'll go over it in the next discussion. And that can be on any previous episode too, the Dermans, or even the last discussion episode. If there's something that you just want clarification for, I'll do my best. Now, let's get into it. So as you've read in the description, this discussion, we're talking about what to expect if a loved one receives an autopsy. To begin with, hopefully this is something you never have to deal with, but unexpected things happen, and it's always good to be aware of this kind of stuff. So to start with, let's say an elderly family member has passed away and it was expected. Well, in a majority of these cases, there will likely not be an autopsy. You combine the age, a documented medical history, and an expectation of passing, and there really is no need. Not every case, of course. There are cases of suspected elder abuse or neglect, which I'll touch on a little later. But for right now, grandma or grandpa passes away, and all other things being equal, you can likely expect no autopsy. Most people are okay with this, but some families might still demand an exam. If they're dealing with a county coroner or state medical examiner, though, they'll likely be denied. As mentioned in the last discussion, a private autopsy can still be made, but it will be paid for out of the family's or whoever requested its pocket. Now, let's move on to something like someone passes away who has no history. So you've got, your brother or father, middle-aged, out for a walk, out jogging, or just sitting at home, and passes away. If they don't have a medical history, there will likely be an examination. And I guess some people need maybe a little clarification for what constitutes a medical history, because some people will say, well, I have a clean medical history. Well, some people will say that, but what that really means is I never go to the doctor. And if you never go to the doctor and you think you have a clean medical history, that actually qualifies as not having a medical history. Again, going back, if someone passes away and no one really knows, if they never went to the doctor, you can pretty well count on they're going to get an autopsy. And a lot of people, it's weird, I guess, dealing with some of this stuff, because some people, some family, some friends, they will be adamant, we want an autopsy, we want to know what happened. But then other people will they don't want anybody to cut on their loved ones. That's something I've heard a lot. I don't want anyone cutting on my father or cutting on my mother. And you understand that to a degree, but there's so much that an autopsy can kind of help with. Sometimes it's for, some people have sort of religious hang-ups, and all that's taken into consideration. Everybody tries to be understanding, but I would say you would want to know, because that could be something where something is discovered that, a loved one had that you didn't know they had, and now it might be not just their medical history, it might be family history. It could be something that you might need to know for yourself or your kids or their kids. There is kind of a method to the madness of why you do an autopsy. This is just stuff you never think about, and it's just good to have an idea. Like, again, I don't like to dwell on stuff, because this can be fairly dark subject matter that people don't want to talk about, and we understand why. But just having a decent idea of what you could expect if tragedy strikes. So if someone passes away, they're discovered, 911 is contacted. Sometimes they'll be transported to the emergency room, sometimes not. EMS kind of checks their vitals, and if they have no vitals, they will, they'll leave the body on scene, and that's when the coroner is called, or a medical examiner investigator. And that's kind of another thing, like pronouncing death. Like, most times the person that's pronouncing death, like a medical examiner investigator or a coroner, they're not necessarily doctors. They're not here to show up and say, let me check and make sure that they are dead. Like, by the time, investigators and coroners show up, I guess it's one of those things like you're pronouncing dead, even though you yourself are not the one that verified it. You're just there to make the official record. So you'll have someone show up like a coroner or a medical examiner investigator. And again, this is if EMS workers left them on scene. If they go to the hospital and they pass away, the ER doctor will pronounce them dead. But back on scene, you'll get the coroner, the ME investigator, and cops have to be called out as well. There's usually at least one officer that's supposed to be there as well. Each state's a little different as to who all needs to be there, because most coroners or ME investigators, they're not really law enforcement. So technically, some law enforcement official needs to be there and should be there. So you'll have a law enforcement official, you'll have your investigator, your coroner, and they're kind of there to check the body. Whether the body comes in for an autopsy or not, you kind of want to cross your T's and dot your I's and make sure everything, that your records are sound. So you're going to have and we'll just say the investigator, so I don't have to keep saying investigator or coroner. You'll have them going and turning the body, photographing the body, checking for just various signs. And like, I don't want to get into too much of that stuff. That would probably just, that would likely be just another discussion. Like, what exactly are people checking for when they're on scene looking at a body? But you're going to have them kind of looking over everything, and then they'll question you about, like last known alive time, medical history, social history, that sort of stuff. And if an autopsy is coming in, that's when they'll contact, either they'll transport themselves or some offices contract out their transport. Usually it's a funeral home, sometimes not. But either way, they'll contact somebody to come pick up the body, transport it to the coroner's office or ME's office for an autopsy. And they'll usually give you, like, they're going to take them to this office. They'll try to give you as accurate a timeline as possible. I guess it all really depends on the office, like their backlog, and I'll try to touch on that in a little bit too. But on scene, what you're dealing with in the moment, that's kind of what you can expect. So you have someone with no history. Someone's going to show up and ask questions and say, do you know anything? If you don't, and it's okay if you don't know. That's something that I've seen a lot when you ask families, like even the people that you're closest with, like some people just don't know, because some people just don't put their kind of information out there. So don't feel bad or that you didn't know certain things about family, because people we're weird. We're private about some things. But just know that if they're not over a certain age, like we had, some offices, they sort of give their investigators an idea of, like, if they're under 65, you need to start asking these questions. If they're over 65, even if they don't have, and I'm using 65 just as kind of like some offices may have a different go-to age, but if someone is over 65 and they don't have a documented medical history, they may still not get an exam just because they're over kind of a certain age. And again, we mentioned last time that these offices are dealing with resource management. as much as you would want everybody to have an exam, at a certain point you have to set up certain policies to account for the resources you do have to make sure that you're not being, and I don't know if this will come off bad, but that you're not being like wasteful. Again, everybody's doing the best they can with what they have. But yeah, if you're over 65 and don't really have a medical history, there's a pretty high possibility you won't get an exam. But anyone under that age, if you don't have a medical history, you might be looking at someone who need to come in just to kind of lay eyes on. Usually, if someone doesn't have a medical history and they get an autopsy, a lot of times you can get, those autopsies are usually, they'll show you something like pretty quickly. The results will come back and be like, oh, he didn't have a history, but when we got to looking, it became pretty obvious. Like he had a heart attack, or he may have had, a more malevolent disease. So that's sort of that for, and I'm trying to be really, again, like last time, just trying to be really broad strokes here. Like there's a lot of things that I could go into detail and, try to hit all the ifs and thens of each kind of case. But honestly, we would just drone on for hours, and that might be okay if there was someone else. But if it's just you listening to my voice, I am not going to drone on to you guys for an hour. Again, if there's something that you want me to kind of clarify, if there's something that you're like, well, what about this or what about that, just email and I promise I'll get to it. All right, so that's people who die with no history. Now, I think last time we mentioned if you're a victim of homicide, you're going to get an autopsy. Shooting, stabbing, and they'll get an autopsy. But I'm going to sort of table that at like the abuse cases. Like I'll kind of you'll kind of see where I'm going with that when I get to it. Possible overdose cases. All right, so these actually happen quite a bit. And these are kind of like people with no history. There will be a lot of times where families they have no idea. Now, a lot of times they will. Like, I guess that these are kind of go all about the spectrum, because you'll have families who don't know, you'll have families who do know, and then you'll have families kind of right there in the middle who kind of are in denial. They probably do know, but they don't acknowledge it. But if someone shows up on scene and suspects an overdose, you're going to get an autopsy. Trauma cases, like motor vehicle accidents, boating accidents, any kind of stuff like that, those can go either way. Like you may get, and we discussed last time, someone with a motor vehicle accident, if it's witnessed and there's no charges pending and you can see on scene like they've got significant head trauma, that you might not get an autopsy. But there's people who have been in, because I think last discussion I talked about motorcyclists. And really, there's been several notable cases. And I chose motorcyclists because they have a tendency to, if there's an accident, they show the most amount of trauma because they're so exposed. But there's been there's been several motorcyclists who have passed away in an accident that you get on scene and you don't really see anything externally the way you would expect. So even if there's no charges pending and it was a witness, it was just an accident, and otherwise it probably wouldn't come in, like someone might be saying, well, we don't really know what killed this person. And that kind of matters. You could just put blunt force trauma, but blunt force trauma it's a broad statement. Usually, if you see that in an autopsy report, they'll say blunt force trauma, and the autopsy report will actually kind of go into a little bit of detail of what that actually entails. But if you're not getting an autopsy and you say blunt force trauma, that could be anything. So that's why sometimes they'll push for this kind of stuff in a motor vehicle accident. There's no blood emanating from, the mouth, the nose, the ears, or anything. You'll be like, they're dead, but we don't see a mark on them. They'll probably get an autopsy. Skeletal remains cases. Oh yeah, if someone just finds if someone finds a set of human remains or suspected human remains buried, and it's not like an official grave site, or just in the woods or something, those will be brought in for an exam. They're usually some of the fastest cases that'll get exams. There's some stuff that you can tell from skeletal remains cases, but that's whenever you need kind of a forensic anthropologist to come in, which again, that's probably another discussion episode of what they can and can't find. So I think that's kind of it in terms of what to expect if someone passes away and what kind of investigators are looking for. Now, another thing I wanted to get into was how long it can take to do an autopsy. From my knowledge and seeing it, an autopsy can take if it's again, it's one of those, like, all other things being equal, if it's just like an overdose or a trauma case or even just kind of a simple gunshot wound homicide, the autopsy itself, from the moment it gets rolled out of the cooler to the moment it gets rolled back in, you're looking at anywhere from 1 hour to 2 hours. It depends how fast the doctor, how fast the tech is. Some can do it in probably a little under an hour. I say an hour, again, that's also including all the paperwork and everything that kind of goes with it. So, 1 to 2 hours per case, approximately. But if we're going through, like, let's go to like a homicide case. You got a single gunshot wound, you can be in and out. But if someone was shot, and I've seen this, like someone was, I believe it was a son who shot the father with I believe it was a AR-15 or some sort of AR, and just lit him up to the point where when the autopsy started and you're removing all the clothing, just bullet fragments are falling out of the clothes. Like, that's something you don't really see a whole lot in gunshot wound cases. You'll see like a random, like, projectile bullet laying out on the table. But this was a case where it was just like you're taking off pieces of clothing. And also notable for something like an AR, there's so much velocity that goes behind those that whenever they're hitting the person, they immediately fragment. Something like a handgun doesn't necessarily do that. So you've got an AR, he's been shot, God knows, I don't even remember how many times. And just bullet pieces are falling out of the clothing when you're picking every little piece off. Yeah, those can take a lot longer. I've seen some doctors just, because they want to get everything. These pathologists, they want to get in there, they want to note as many of these wounds as they possibly can. Some are far more meticulous than others. Some kind of cluster them all together. It all depends on the doc. But even with a fast doc, you're looking at at least a few hours or so working on it. And I've seen up to, okay, we've spent, a day working on this case, and there's still a lot of stuff left to do. So it's going to be at least a 2-day case. That happens every once and again. And that can be the shooting case, even a stab wound case. If you've got many stab wounds, again, some docs they'll cluster them together, and it'll still take them a while. It'll take them a couple of hours, but it's still done in a day. But there's other docs that will say, no, I'm gonna get everything. So again, check your local listings for those. Overdose cases, they'll probably be the most, like, consistent. However long they take they're never going to get any longer or shorter. Overdose cases are cases where you suspect it, it's one of the, I guess this will be kind of weird to hear, but you hear as an investigator or a pathologist, like, it's an overdose. Like, well, we hope that's what's going to come back when we do the blood, but we kind of need to check everything, because if it's a suspected overdose and we run the tox and it comes back negative, if we didn't do a really thorough exam, we might be screwed. We may not know exactly why this person died. So whenever you're doing an overdose case, you're taking all of the samples you possibly can, multiple tubes of blood, vitreous, which is your eye fluid, urine. You're getting all the best samples you can, because there are, like, and again, there's schools of thought which you would think blood is blood, but when you get to working with some of these doctors and you kind of learn, how they see it, like, some will say, well, no, this blood's better than that blood. We want blood further away from the heart. That's better blood. It's more accurate blood. So yeah, you want to get your best samples and go ahead and get out all that, and then you'll actually do an autopsy, just to kind of, like, again, cross your T's, dot your I's. Like, yeah, we suspect an overdose, but let's check just to see if there's anything to see. I mentioned skeletal remains, but decomposed bodies can take a little bit longer, just because when bodies start to decompose, you're losing a lot of evidence. And that doesn't necessarily mean, like, someone killed this person, that kind of, like, homicide, like a bullet wound, that kind of stuff. Like, no, if someone passed away and lived by themselves, and let's say they had a heart attack or something, if they start decomposing, you'll lose a little bit of that. Now, there'll always be, like, some stuff that's kind of left behind. And again, I'm trying to be very broad about this, but since we're on the subject of decomposed bodies, like, you could look at the heart and say, okay, well, this could be a heart attack, and that would make sense, because when you start looking, like, one of the because everything on a decomposed body, it's decomposing. It's slowly breaking down. But if someone had a heart attack, you could actually check and see that they have calcification in their arteries. And that actually, everything's breaking down. Like the calcification is that hardening, that actually takes a lot longer to break down. So you would actually see that in a decomposed body. But I digress. Decomposed bodies, they don't necessarily take longer. They're slippery, I guess, is the best way to put it. They are slippery. They can be very slippery, especially the early decomposed cases where there's a lot of bloating and skin slippage, and they're juicy. There's no other way to say it. They're juicy bodies, and doctors and techs, you're kind of fighting with it. Anytime you try to move the body, it's slipping, and especially if you're dealing with like a heftier person, like these body exam tables aren't that wide. So when you're trying to manipulate a body, move it, turn it over, like it can be very annoying and time consuming. And going back, when we talked about homicide cases, I did want to bring back like elder abuse cases or neglect. Those can be kind of involved. Now, some people are some people are okay with not having an exam, but you'll have families sometimes who are just quick to point fingers at whoever was taking care of grandma or whatever, and they want to say, we suspect neglect, we suspect foul play. The thing with like elder abuse or neglect cases is that they're usually very, it's not hard to decipher whether or not this person has been taken care of. So like some people say, well, they had a bruise on their back, so we suspect neglect. It's like, well, lots of people who are elderly, who are in bed a lot, they'll get bruises on their back but because elderly people bruise a lot easier. Doesn't mean they were neglected. And again, I guess I could really digress into that, but the overall point is that if it is suspected elder abuse and the family's really pushing it, it can come in for an exam. The doctors will look over it, but again, like usually you can know, doctors can kind of take one look at a body and say, I am not suspecting elder abuse. We'll do our due diligence. We'll check for this, that, and the other. But like usually it is extremely obvious if someone has been neglected or abused. And I'm sort of going off notes here. Let's see. We went over, how long they can take. Because some people you may want to know if you're planning funeral services. Again, the most you're looking at for an examination is once the examination starts, one day, 2 days at the max for the pathologist to kind of, and some days, I say a day or 2 days, but some days like you can get a case in and out in just a couple hours. Like a body can be checked into the morgue at 9 a.m. and be out the door in the funeral home, transport back to the funeral home by 10:30, 11. Like it can be that fast as long as you're not backed up. And that's kind of the next thing I wanted to lead into is case backlogs. Some days, some offices are like, yeah, there's not much going on. There's a few cases, but we can kind of get everything in and out and complete today. Some cases may take longer just by their nature, but some offices there'll be 40 cases deep. A loved one of yours will pass away and there's 40 people ahead of them. That can you're looking at, and again, it can vary so much. Like I've seen a case come in early in a week and it would take 3-4 days before the autopsy, before they could actually get to it. And that's kind of all hands on deck. Everybody's just, grinding. But usually when a coroner or even a family member can call these offices and just you can ask for an ETA. Again, when you're doing that, just be mindful. Everything that we've kind of gone over so far, if you call and ask for an ETA, this is what a medical examiner or investigator or a coroner, this is what's going through their heads, is everything we've just discussed. So when you ask for an ETA, they're like, well, if this, then if, and then. And hopefully they're not short with you. Hopefully they're not rude in any way, which they shouldn't be. But if it seems like they're not giving you an accurate ETA, it's because there's a lot of factors to be aware of with this kind of stuff. And there's nothing that can be done during an autopsy that'll prevent a funeral, an open casket funeral. Now, there are things such as, the body's decomposed, there likely won't be an open casket. But what they mean to say is nothing that, if all other things being equal, someone comes in and their body is in a state where you're like, we can have an open casket funeral for this person. Nothing that happens during an autopsy is going to change that. And most autopsies include opening the head, taking out the brain. That's not going to change anything. Still have an open casket. You'll never know. Like, these funeral homes can really pull rabbits out of their hats sometimes, because there is some cases that I knew of that were like, I don't think that case will get an open casket. And then, you've got a talented mortician, and like, they truly do magic where you're like, oh my God, they did that. And I want to say there was like one of these people said once, like, it takes to undo, and this is the way they did it because they were being very snide to us. They were joking, but they were being snide. They're like, yeah, it takes us a good 4 hours to undo what you guys do during autopsy. So yeah, I'll say that nothing an autopsy does prevents an open casket, but it's still, it can really make a lot of work for morticians and funeral homes. And I think that's all I got for this episode. Hopefully, if this is something you never wanted to hear about or think about, hopefully I didn't like traumatize you. Hopefully, if the unthinkable does happen, you'll have an understanding of kind of what you're expecting, what's going to happen. This will probably be its own discussion at a certain point. But turnaround time, like, the body will be released to the funeral home. Like, let's say a loved one dies, they get an autopsy, they're in and out in a day. They're in the back of the funeral home, arrangements are made, they're, buried a few days later. The death certificate, now that could be held up for a little bit, and that's probably its own discussion, but lots of factors, like, again, everything I just told you about this kind of stuff, like a doctor's backlog could be, they like to say, I've heard like 3 months is a good turnaround time, which sounds long, but that's just kind of the nature of it, is the turnaround time for getting the autopsy report completed and getting the death certificate signed. Yeah, that can take a little bit longer. And again, it all depends on the case. If it's a overdose case, you're waiting on toxicology. If it's a homicide case, some doctors want to review everything. Even though they've already got their autopsy results, they want to see what the investigators, they want to see the police reports and see everything they have to say, so they can mark, or they can kind of adjust their reports as needed if there's something they weren't told, or, that kind of thing. And they won't release the reports until they have that kind of stuff. So yeah, you're looking, some people like to say 3 months, but I've seen, it can take a lot longer. And again, it all kind of depends on the case. So that's just something you would have to discuss. Just be it like when someone passes away, best case scenario, they're kind of in and out and the death certificate is signed in a reasonable amount of time, but things come up, like there's a backlog. There's just all these little, again, everything we've kind of gone over so far is, it goes into how long some of this stuff can take. So just another thing to keep in mind, you don't want the unthinkable to happen, but if it does, this is kind of what you can have to consider or think about. And hopefully you come away with this with at least a little bit better understanding of, if it's taking a while, then, why is it taking a while? It's usually because of everything we've just gone over. But I think, again, I'll leave it right here. If there's something you want me to clarify, anything, you can definitely reach out, autopsypodcast@gmail.com. Again, social media, we're everywhere at this point. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, we're on YouTube. I think we are almost at every place you can get your podcast, Spotify, iTunes, Amazon, Google. I always like to add Audible because I love Audible, even though Audible is part of Amazon. So since we're on Amazon, we're on Audible, but I love Audible. Maybe we'll get a sponsor one day and it'll be Audible, because that'll be the most honest sponsor that I think we'll ever do is those guys, because I love them. But I think that'll be it. Autopsypod.com, and thank you so much for listening. And I hope you'll continue to listen. And again, I do want to hear, like, when the next episode comes out, I do want to know if you prefer kind of that format versus if you listen to Kathleen Peterson's, and even the Dermans, I'm sure, but specifically Kathleen's case versus the one that's going to come out in January. If you notice a difference, if you don't notice a difference, if you have a preference, let us know, because we want you to enjoy the program, and we want to be able to make something that people can consume without feeling like we're just beating them over the head with too much information. But if you want to hear more information, then that's exactly what we'll do. But again, thanks for listening, guys. Take care of yourselves and each other.